This presentation is delivered by the Stanford Center for Professional Development.
Terry wanted me to do a talk similar to one I gave at Beikai a while back. So if you were at that talk, you can leave now and pretend that you heard me give it again. I'm just going to tell you some stories, guys. That's it. The point here really is just to show, to share with you how the humanities and technology have always been interwoven in the things that I've been involved with personally that I feel are important in some way. I could easily talk about other people's work, but at this point in my life, I'm going to talk about mine because I sort of can't remember other people's work as well. So here are some stories about crossing boundaries, and here are the destinations we're going to look at quickly. We have a little intermezzo about design education that I won't take too much time on. This is really a history of voyages. And the first big voyage that I took was this book, Computers as Theater. This is a picture of the Teatro Olimpico. Many of you may be familiar with it. And in this image, for me, everything is represented that's important about my observations about the relationship between computers and technology and theater. The first perspective I find especially interesting. So if you walked up one of these alleys on this stage, you would turn into a giant because the buildings and the scenery gets tinier, sort of the Hobbit trick. So there's a kind of forcing of that single point perspective. That is something that really interests me and has changed a lot in my career. The notion of the representation of a place and that actors are representing characters is important. This is not the Teatro Olimpico. This is the Ohio State Theater where I worked. And this is one of those wonderful posed pictures that you hate from Shakespeare plays. But working as both an actor and a director in the theater gave me some unique and varied perspectives on why theater is a good metaphor, a useful, workable metaphor for what it is that we do when we're designing interaction. As an actor, certainly you've got several people that you're interacting with simultaneously, right? The other players and the audience, and whoever that is. And you can feel the audience, and there is a difference, as you all know, between live theater and television or film. As a director, to me, this is a role of design, a good metaphor for a designer. Because as a designer, you need to create a vision of what a thing is going to look like and be like and act like, and then get people who have all different kinds of skill sets to see that same picture and go down that same road. So that's another similarity, I think, between the art of theater and what we have to do as designers of interactive media. Things started changing for me in the late 70s. Everybody who lived through the late 70s could say that. This was an era of improvisational theater, and audience involvement on the stage became a big deal on Broadway, like Dionysus in '69, Living Theater. Other institutions started to do improvisational work with audiences, and the boundary between the audience and the actor began to morph a little bit. And that's actually reminiscent of some of the things that happened in the medieval theater, but let's not go there. At that point in time, I was directing an interactive, this is a picture from an interactive version of a play about Robin Hood that I co-wrote, based on the 11th century materials, although we did slip Maid Marian in there. And you can see right here how the actors are respecting my leadership just by looking at their faces. So in this version of Robin Hood, a minstrel greets the children who come to the building. We did this on the Ohio State Oval. Begins singing a song and it asks the children to follow him, her. And I was standing around in costume, and I have this memory of a little kid asking me, what kind of tree is that? What is this tree? And I said, well, this is an oak tree in Sherwood Forest. And he was like, an oak tree in Sherwood Forest. It totally changed him. I mean, now he's going to look at oak leaves differently. You know, something magic happened there that was important. It plays into the story. So the audience would shout directions and suggestions to the actors as the play was going on. So there was a kind of participatory authorship, you might say, of what was happening. We had a wonderful instance where we had an audience of blind children who could hear things going on in the broadsword battles, and were giving really interesting tips, like he's moving around behind you, he's using his left hand, you know, stuff that was not the sort of thing we were hearing from sighted audiences. Anyway, you can see that I'm moving from a career in Shakespeare and Gilbert and Sullivan into a more improvisational space. And that is exactly the time when I met a guy named Joe Miller, who was working at Battelle Memorial Institute in Columbus, Ohio. And he was running one of the earliest computer graphics labs around. One night, under the influence of his personality and other 70s things, he took me to see his lab. And what I saw there were images coming in from the Viking mission, painting themselves very slowly on the screen. And I thought, oh my God, whatever this is, I want a piece of it. You know, I want to be involved with this. This is speaking to me, to a deep part of me, as strongly as the theater speaks to me. Well, about a year later, this guy quit Battelle and formed a company called Cybervision. This was in 1976. Cybervision was a little box that hooked into your TV, and it read code at 200 baud from off of an audio tape, and we had 2K of usable RAM, and we were using alphanumeric keypads to navigate. And he asked me, I was working on my PhD in theater, well, would you, and at that time I was doing some really boring stuff about Bernard Shaw. He said, well, would you like to come and work here? And we want to do some animated fairy tales. So I got very excited, and I immediately came to work there, and I sort of reinvented cell animation because I was too dumb to like figure it out. I did things like lip sync snakes, and designed interactive versions of things like, I'm trying to think, The Princess and the Pea. The problem was that when you were loading only into 2K and you were running off of audio tape, you had to do converging nodes at every load. So the player couldn't make a real difference in the action because you couldn't branch very far. You had to always come back to the same point for the next data load. The cool thing about using audio tape, though, was that you could use live human voices and cue them to movements on the screen. So there were interesting trade-offs. What I learned from that experience more than anything was that that genuine, meaningful action is essential to a sense of engagement and presence, really, that you have to be able to make decisions that make a difference, even if it involves an elaborate branching structure. But people don't really go for converging nodes. You know, it gets really boring, and we were seeing some of this in the early video game industry. So here's kind of a map of that journey, and I'm using maps because I like maps. So you can see the humanities territories above, the technology territories below. And I was really exploring this chance intersection emotionally and structurally for me between theater, enactment, representation, and the technology that I had just been exposed to. So I'll show you some points on that map. Obviously, acting and improv came first in the world of humanities for me. I had the experience of seeing a production of Lanterna Magica in Prague in the late 70s. This was a multimedia company that did amazing things with projection. They're still around. Does anybody know these guys, who they are? So, for example, they had a dancer with a round screen that he was holding in his hand. He was moving around the stage, and they were projecting a woman onto that screen with perfect accuracy. And later on, I kind of used that technique in a production of Alice in Wonderland, where we had people walking in and out of video through slits in a scrim. Lanterna Magica gave me this notion of the sort of permeability of the proscenium, the permeability of acting and technology combined, and that it could be done, and it could be done well. I mentioned participatory theater, living theater, Dionysus in '69. One of the things that really took my breath away about medieval and early Renaissance, late medieval theater was the Commedia dell'arte. And what was going on there was that a troupe these guys were actors whose tradition had survived Hadrian's condemnation of the theater, and they were wandering around even before the Quem Quiritus trope brought the theater back through the church. They used the stock characters from the Roman theater, pretty much. They had memorized bits of business, the donkey enema joke, or the braggadocio soldier with the maid joke, or whatever. And they had stock characters. But what they would do is, when they came into a town as a traveling show, they would find out what was going on in the town. Is there some sex scandal? Is the government corrupt? Did somebody just get murdered? And they would improvise their work so that they shaped those issues into the play, and then plop down these bits of business called lazzi, or little pieces of script in between. So this is an early example of how you could combine a sort of sense of personal relevance with things that were already fixed and set. And it gave me another view of how interactivity might be able to work. I won't go too far with that. I fell in love with Aristotle's Poetics, and that's kind of where I started my journey, although I could as easily have written Computers as Theater using a Brechtian model, and I kind of wish I had. So look for it in the rewrite, which is coming out next year. Now, we look at the technology side of that. I told you about Cybervision, the company with the interactive fairy tales and the notion of interactive stories. When Cybervision folded, we all went out to work for this upstart company called Atari. Came in 1979. I was the first woman in the home computer division. I can remember, I had a phone and a cubicle, no desk, no chair. So I was sitting there on the floor. Finally went in the ladies' room, and there were all these guys in there smoking dope. And I said, dudes, you know what? I work here now. I'm going to need to use this actually as a restroom. So I kicked them out. Eventually, I ended up in the Atari research lab because I got up to here with the game side of the business. Not the game mechanics, but the way the company was running it. They were really, these guys from Warner believed that if they had a hot license like Superman, that would magically make a great game. And they were giving people not enough time and too much money, and there were a lot of drugs. And anyway, Alan Kay got hired from Xerox PARC to run the Atari Systems Research Lab. So when it looked like I was about done with the software side, I ran across the street and I said to Alan, you got to give me a job, please. I know what you're up to. I know your work, please. So I turned out to be one of the very few people in that lab who wasn't straight out of the architecture machine group, which later became the media lab. And Alan was terrific. One of the things that happened, though, was that he wasn't there very often. He was always gone. So a bunch of us got together and we decided we would invent his replacement, Dr. Arthur Fischel, who had a history of working with the British Postal Service and had also developed squid jerky and other interesting products. And Arthur Fischel came to be the head of the lab. We got him an employee number. I impersonated his voice using an Eventide harmonizer. So I answered the phone for him. He was British. And this culminated in 12 of us authored email from him. And it culminated in a live teleconference between Arthur and the rest of the lab. So we're back in a conference room somewhere all wired up, and I'm in drag with beard. I'm wearing Michael Neymark's jacket. And every time the scene cut to us live, there would be a different travel poster in the background, so it looked like he was levitating. A few people noticed this. There was an assassination attempt in the teleconference. It was nutty. Afterwards, we did live Q&A, and people kept trying to break me. They kept trying to prove that I was on tape, that this could not be live. So when we finally got the idea through to people that it was live, we all sat there. We ended the teleconference. We said, wow, we just invented a person. And we did it as a collective. And this person's behavior was emergent from all of us watching each other improvise him. That stays with me as the kind of thing that now we maybe take for granted. But then it was pretty impressive. I remember Douglas Adams was in the audience that day, was visiting the lab, and went to dinner with him. And he looked over, and there was still a little bit of crepe hair on my cheek. He said, "That was you?" He was the only person who recognized me, which is great. Anyway, at Atari Labs, I got introduced to concepts of artificial intelligence. Unfortunately, I went down the road of expert systems, which turned out not to be the best choice, but at least it got my feet wet. The guys from the Media Lab brought in a bunch of information and ideas about the notion of presence, the notion of being co-present with other people or being present in a place where you're not. I'm thinking now of Michael Neymark and Scott Fisher, for example, bringing those ideas into the lab. That was also the moment at which I met Don Norman, who has been consistently my mentor, even though he is a crab cake. He's one of the smartest people I know, and he gave me an opportunity to pursue some of the ideas that were starting to coalesce in my brain. So I have to thank him. He's a little town on my map. Another milestone for me was producing little computer people at Activision, Rich Gold's program. It was, anybody know it? Yeah, you're not that old, but you studied it, right? You had it? Okay.
There are some variants.
Yeah. It's a little dude living on your screen, right? And it's like a plan view, like I Love Lucy. And you can see him go up the stairs, and you can see his bed and his kitchen and his refrigerator and the piano in his living room. And you have to sort of take care of him. You talk to him. You remind him to go to the grocery store. You make sure he's got enough to eat, and if he's really happy, he'll play you something on the piano. So it was like a goldfish bowl sort of thing, and a kind of interaction that felt entirely different, from playing games. The coda there is that when the sales guys would take this product to trade shows, they would forget to take care of him, and he'd die. So when they went to demo him, he'd be all green and in bed, right? Dead. So we had to make a version of it where he didn't die, so the sales guys could show it. Anyway, the way that interaction felt, was just like reaching through a portal and directly engaging with the character. So that's another step on that journey. At Apple, I worked at the Human Interface Group and worked on the Guides project, which was an exploration of using storytelling agents as guides through the Encyclopedia Britannica Westward Movement chapter. And so we created personas with very different points of view. Pioneer woman, bear skinner, Native American, etc. And we shot video of stories that would show up depending on what the person seemed to be searching for, and often would challenge the point of view that they appeared to have as they were navigating the material. So that was about the time that they did the Apple commercial. What was that called? That agent? Knowledge Navigator. That thing was happening. And then, of course, Microsoft brought us the paperclip and Bob and all that stuff. Anyway, in Guides, we really did try to use storytelling and narrative as a way to help people navigate information. So there's another vector that came in for me, and all that stuff sort of collided into this book, Computers as Theater, which is changing now. And I guess the big learning for me out of this is seeing through structure. I am an unrepentant structuralist. I have difficulty reading French postmodernism, although Debord is an exception. But I feel that structural models are incredibly important, and the one I chose to use in this book was Aristotle's Poetics, but there are others that are just as effective and some that we might even think up ourselves. So that was the big aha for me. And then learning through the experience of all these nuances of how I'm feeling about interacting primarily with agents or personas and games on the screen, and trying to wrap my head around. So when it's working and you feel like you're right in there with that little guy, how does that happen? You know, how does that happen? And the way it happens is that the cognitive distance is reduced. I didn't use these terms in the book. I'm going to next time. In other words, you're no longer thinking of operating the computer in order to talk to the little man. You're just talking to the little man. And this notion of the barrier or the proscenium that was the desktop in that day goes away. And that's sort of the big aha for me, and it guided my work for a long time afterwards. It came out in paperback with the most horrifying cover I've ever seen. But I did get to do a little ranting about virtual reality. In the next version, I'm going to be talking a lot about emergence. You can tell by the way I talk about the book now that has a lot to do with what I think I discovered, and I'm also using much more biology as structure than just literary theory. Okay, here's second map. Second map takes us into the wonderful world of virtual reality. Do you guys remember virtual reality, some of you? You remember that there were like actual rock stars in virtual reality, like Jaron Lanier with his dreadlocks and Scott Fisher. So it was a wild time. But this sort of impulse to get into it, I think, comes from being an actor. You know, put your head in it, be there with your body in some other space with other characters. It's such a pleasurable thing when you're an actor to do that. So the fantasy was to be able to dive into a dream physically as well as emotionally without, I mean, this is one step beyond getting rid of the interface as a cognitive thing. It actually gets rid of any kind of two-dimensional barrier that we might think we have. So that's the context. I thought a lot about authorship in the beginning of that exploration, in the sense that when you have, when a computer game is working well, and many different outcomes can occur at many different stages, to the extent that that's true, the player becomes a co-author. And the control of the maker or the designer is reduced to a certain extent. In other words, you can't have absolute control of what kind of experience somebody's going to have, say in Worlds of Warcraft or Second Life or going back, Space Invaders. Even then, you don't have a complete control like the author of a play or a director would. So as we look at it, when you're faced with a situation where players and participants begin to co-author the, quote, plot of what's unfolding in real time, the author loses formal control and has to rely on material control to predispose people to make dramatically interesting choices. Yes?
So is your sense, I'm curious why you think that immersive virtual reality isn't nearly as pervasive today as the enthusiasts thought 25 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering whether is it because diving into the dream is really important, and in fact we can do it with a book, we don't need VR.
Exactly.
Or is it because, we don't care about diving into the dream, or diving into the dream doesn't work even in VR, or what's your, because it's kind of surprising in some sense.
Yeah. My sense of it was that two things happened. One is that nobody could make a workable business model for full-up VR. Like if you put it in any kind of public installation, you got to have at least 5 minutes of dwell time for it to work at all, right? So the throughput goes way down, and it doesn't work for the economics of like an arcade or an amusement park, given the cost of the equipment. Also, in some cultures, specifically in Japan, people had real difficulty around the hygiene of wearing a head-mounted display. They just didn't like the way it felt. And then we got nailed by this whole BS about desktop VR, where assertions were made that you could simulate virtual reality on a flat screen. And to the extent that the word got watered down, it sort of turned into a turbo kind of, you know, how turbo just got, bleh, or design thinking, desktop VR, it's like everything's VR, so it kind of melted. Nobody kept working on that problem. I think it's back to a certain extent. People have discovered the power of audio and constructing environments that aren't as expensive but are just as immersive, for example. But at the time, it was that nobody could come up with a business model that worked. Even as SGI, whose business model was primarily based on training, you know, training people to drive Caterpillars and stuff, went out of business. So that's what I think happened. But it's still worth talking about if you don't mind. Would you like me to just rip through this part? Or?
I don't know. I was curious.
Well, yeah, it was. So there are several little things going on here, and I don't want to dwell on too many of them. But when Rachel Strickland and I conceived of the project that we ended up doing at Banff, it was really about the relationship between landscape and narrative. And we were trying to create an interactive environment where people were encouraged to create narratives and leave them for others to listen to share narratives and engage in narrative play within a space that emulated the natural environment where we were doing the installation. So we used different means of capturing that natural environment and had a lot of magical affordances in the environment. We got questioned a lot about, well, why are you doing this? Why are you capturing the environment that we're standing in, you know, and making this interactive thing? And the answer is, this is indexical to the environment. We are pointing at the environment. We're loading it up with meaning and affordances for play as you get out there and stare at rocks and see faces. It's the same reason people make photographs or paintings. They're indexical. There's a spiritual element involved, even, I think. Anyway, took a lot of heat for that. Tough. Barry Lopez was my hero in those days, still is my favorite writer and my probably most important literary influence. So Barry was there with me all the time. Not going to talk about space. An interesting thing happened as we worked on this particular project. By the way, I'd done VR before with telepresence research and all that jazz, but that's so nasty we don't want to go there. The collaboration element between the technologists and the artists in this project was really hard. It was harder than anything I'd ever done before because their gifts and views were so disparate. And there ended up having to be sort of a palace coup to get things straightened out. So I kind of discovered that there are some limits you can reach in terms of how diverse people are unless you have agreement on a grand strategic goal. And the way we got through that knothole was to agree on a grand strategic goal, which wasn't, in fact, to produce this massively cool virtual reality experience in 3 months at the Banff Center with the first silicon graphics reality engine off the assembly line. It was to make a design statement. It was to say that this glorious medium, which is currently being used to train people to drive Caterpillars or astronauts, could be equally useful in helping us live out, say, a futurist hypothesis, where we want to find out what happens when certain affordances are in the world, right? That there are many other uses for the medium than were being exploited at the time. So it was a grand strategic goal was a design statement. And then the takeaways we could make from having built the thing and seeing people use it. That was a new thing for me, and I thought it was cool that we came together around that understanding of it. Does that make sense? I learned a lot about the senses. I guess that's more like science, really, but proprioception was incredibly important. So, for example, I love this story. In the day of early virtual reality, people wore a helmet with a head-mounted display on it, these wide-angle video screens, stereoptic. And then they had a glove, usually, which they pointed. They could get pull-down menus with the glove. I always thought, that is the stupidest thing I ever heard. Why do you go to the trouble of emulating a three-dimensional space and then put a pull-down menu in it? Are you nuts? Anyway, so the your intended direction of movement was the point, and there were gestures that you could use to make certain things happen. So you'd end up moving like this, right? So what we did with Placeholder was to make two little grippies that were just cheap little plastic guys that looked at how hard they were being squeezed. We put a sensor on the belt and a sensor on the helmet. So we took direction of movement from the pelvis and direction of gaze from the head, and we gave people two hands. So it went from here to here, right? It was all present. We'd open up all these other vectors of movement, and it allowed people to do very different things. So that was important. And as you know now, we were just talking at lunch about Connect and We and some of the other great stuff that's come along that takes advantage of that. Down in technology land, I must confess I was under the influence of Dr. Leary to the extent that I was his producer in the video game business. And so I got to see this sort of sex appeal part of VR and the early Johnny Mnemonic stuff and, you know, the whole Gibson crowd and all that jazz. But Timothy was so hopeful about what VR could do for society, I sort of fell under his spell. I was irritated to death by polygons at that point because they looked awful. It just looked like all the same. It had no texture. Yeah, texture mapping, it didn't do it for me. So that's why we fooled around with different ways of capturing and representing natural environments that didn't involve polygons. So in one case, we used really an auditory map with a three-dimensional sound. In one of the venues, we did a tiled video map of another, and we did a virtual relief projection in another, a video on a virtual relief-shaped screen, just because I hated polygons. I learned a lot about direct manipulation, that it wasn't just drag and drop stuff, that if you could actually get hold of something and move it, even though we weren't simulating gravity there, direct manipulation took on a much deeper meaning when you could actually pick something up and move it. So we had these things called voice holders that were rocks floating around with closed eyes and closed mouths. And if you grabbed one, it would open its eyes and it would say, "I'm listening." And you could tell it a story. And when you were done, it would close its eyes and open its mouth. You could put it here. And then somebody who came and tapped it could hear the story that you'd put in it. And what ended up happening was, as people came through the environment, they started building these lattices and walls of stories that connected to each other. And then at night, I would go in like the janitor and take out all the dumb ones that said, you know, Susie loves Frank, and, you know, clean up the mess. Anyway, the grand strategic goal, the purpose of the system was the main point. I've said that before. So we ended up with the Placeholder virtual environment. And I believe it's a direct ancestor of Shar Davies' incredible work with Immerse called Osmose. If you don't know about this or haven't seen it, it's really worth looking at. It's an incredible exploration of the capabilities of VR. So diving into the dream really turned into a lesson for me in telling a new story about what a technology was for, how it worked, and communicating discoveries by making things, if that makes any sense. It was a great trip. It was a wonderful time. We had 13 computers and duct tape, you know. Here's some pictures. You can see the relief projection on the top of the waterfall. So we had video running on that grid, which simulated the shape of the waterfall. In the middle, you're seeing some of the graphics for the characters that inhabited the space. It was a two-person interactive environment, which I believe it was the first of in VR. There was a big argument raging at the time about how people felt about their bodies in virtual reality, and I was noticing some gender differences. I was hearing men say, in general, I can see from any perspective. I can be anywhere here, and they would describe it to me more or less in plan view. And women were more likely to say, "I'm taking my body into this environment," and they would describe it to me in elevation. So that was something that led me to do gender studies later. The other thing is that when you first came into the world, there were petroglyphs of animals, and they were telling little stories about themselves. And if you got close enough to one, they'd toll you in, come closer, come closer. If you stuck your head in it, it became your body. So, for example, you were embodied as Crow if you walked to Crow. And one of the design problems we had was, how does Crow fly? And I went around asking people, how do you fly in your dreams? You know, my design research, and they're saying, I go like this, or men were doing hydrofoil things. I go like this, and I was just stymied. And then I realized this always means flying. So we had to then figure out how to measure what a flap was, and tune flapping, and I was the flappist, and I got these great muscles right in here. You know, so the first time it's like 3 big flaps, and you're 3 inches off the ground, and the next time it's whoosh, out of the simulation, and you're looking down at it like down there. So I had to do a lot of flying, and it was really fun. So I'll go on to Purple Moon. It's another journey with some different things on the map. Rutland has nothing to do with Purple Moon, except we were kind of in a rut with computer games at the time. There had been no games specifically designed for girls' interests, except one Barbie game that came out, I think, in 1987. And the designer said at a conference that they were throwing marshmallows as the gameplay because girls weren't very good with projectiles. I wanted to throw something at him. So after 17 years of producing and designing basically material that was geared at a male audience, everybody just said, yeah, of course, this is boy stuff. And to a certain extent it still is. I got kind of sick of it. I got kind of sick of the rules of gameplay that I had to live by in that world. And I got sick of going into my kids' 6th grade class and seeing all the girls sitting in the back and all the boys using the computers, because those guys, by playing video games, had learned that if you bang on return 27 times, something's going to happen, where the girls were thinking, I'll break it. You know, there was a huge divide. And so we had really 2 goals in mind, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I started with gender studies, talked to a lot of different people, read a lot of stuff, looked at play theory, brain-based gender differences, utterly taboo to talk about in the 80s. You could not talk about that. It was like off limits. But there are actually some pretty significant brain-based sex differences. And they're overlapping Gaussian distributions. You know, it's not like everybody's one way and everybody's the other, but it is the case that females tend to be body-centric navigators, which is why we turn maps upside down. And males tend to be able to do dead reckoning and work better with plan view representations. And there are all kinds of exceptions and nuances there, but that is a fairly large difference. The other difference is that females tend to perform less well on mental rotation exercises when they're under time pressure. So, you've seen those tests where you say, okay, which of these is the picture of this pipe from the left or something? And you have to imagine it in a different orientation. So if you've got a clock running, as in a computer game, a female is going to take more time to solve that problem. Why? Because they're body-centric navigators. They literally imagine themselves moving around to the other side, while men can just flip it, typically speaking. Now, if you take away the time pressure, performance equalizes. But think about side-scrolling computer games, okay? You've got to do a rotation to do the side-scrolling if you're a body-centric navigator, and you also have to do a translation from the plane of the screen to the keyboard to the plane of the screen. So no wonder, right, that we had girls not very happy, never mind the content, with the form of computer games in the day. So we interviewed about 1,000 kids all over the country, girls, boys, parents, and another 500 experts of various types to get our data. So it was a really well-funded, by Paul Allen, research project. I have this great memory of taking the prototype in and showing it to Paul, and he said, can you do this for boys? And it's like, oh, you really? You didn't pay any attention. Gosh, but I'm glad you gave me $4 million. There was an ethical goal involved for us, both in terms of the making of games that spoke to females and the making of games that enabled women to get, and girls, more comfortable with using computer technology. Yeah.
Question on the previous point. There. So it seems like science fiction is also very tailored towards male audiences, or at least it has been historically. And that has, it seems it has less to do with metaphors and body interactions than computer games. So do you see, I mean, why do you think that is the case too?
Well, who's writing the books? Who's writing the books? You know, that's one question. You have a pretty solid male authorship in science fiction. Although I'm a total science fiction nut, so I'm probably not the right person to talk to about this. I think hard science fiction is harder for girls and women because, generally speaking, they're not taking those classes in high school. Their interest in those things is not inflamed or engaged in any way. So it's harder to read the hard science fiction. We'll go over and read Arthur Clarke or Vernor Vinge, or William Gibson, because that's much more narrative and less hard science. And I think that's just an artifact of the choices that girls and women have made as a result of gender labeling, not gender difference, but labeling in this culture. I can remember when I was in a physics class in high school, I was the only girl there, and my choice was, okay, am I going to stay here and never have a date? And I dropped the class, That was how it was in the 60s, and it continues to kind of be that way. But I think science fiction is becoming more broadly, disseminated, especially because it shows up in film a lot. I'll try to get through this quickly. I want to say that I learned a lot about strategy and tactics in this enterprise. And Rob calls it the Laurel maneuver, Rob, my husband. What I learned, and what I am able to pass along now to designers, is that one strategy can serve two different grand strategic goals. We usually look at it the other way. You got a grand strategy and strategies in support of it. But you can have a strategy that serves two different goals. So one goal is get girls' hands on the computer, and another was through the content to give girls emotional rehearsal space for their adolescent challenges. And I won't go into the content, but if you're interested in it, look at Utopian Entrepreneur. And that sort of saves us when we're faced with working in commercial environments that we might not particularly agree with. But if the work we're doing serves a grand strategic goal that we have as human beings that maybe has cultural significance, you can make a case that it's worth doing anyway. Anyway, that's another conversation. Have I covered all of this? Oh, one thing to say is that we invented an interface that we called emotional navigation, so that you could mouse over the main character at various points and hear the choices she was considering, and how she felt. So I don't know. I feel like I just want to be mean right now. And sometimes whining worked in that game. There was no way to win it. What happened was the plot was just all over the place and lots of little Easter eggs and stuff. But the idea was that girls that age have tween girls tend to have a sense of inevitability about their social situation and about who they can be in the world. And that step, getting from there to a notion of personal agency, is probably the major stepping stone into becoming a teenager for all of us, as opposed to a tween. And then you kind of have to step through it again in a different form as an adult. So we were trying to build something healthy for girls that were kind of paralyzed in that space. So we had two grand strategic goals. We used one strategy. Does that make sense? This was a big deal to me, at least, to discover that. I learned a lot about distribution and retail environments. It turned out to sell computer games for girls, you had to go into the retailer, and provide them with the whole aisle. The end caps, the setup, the arrangement. We had to put our product right next to Barbie fashion designer, even though I could strangle Mattel. But we had to give retailers a huge amount of support to even get it in the door with this kind of game. We also, by the way, gave the game major cooties. If a boy wouldn't go near it, just even the packaging, because what we wanted not to have happen was for boys to play it and say, well, this is lame, and their sisters say, oh, okay, I feel bad, I won't play it, We wanted it to just like suck from the get-go, have repellent powers. And that was great. So the New York Times guy panned it, and the separatist community panned it, but we were in the top 100 games for 2 years running with those games. And I found out, I discovered some things about the power of transmedia. This is another kind of way of thinking about osmosis through the membranes of technology and fiction, that if you can extrude an object that's real, that also shows up in this game, or a little character that's real or physical that shows up in this game, the world starts to take on a different kind of dimensionality. And we also did this in a virtual way by allowing, by soliciting girls to write for the school newspaper of the characters, and we would post that stuff on our website. So there was a real sort of social network built into the way this thing rolled out. In fact, after our board shut us down because they were more interested in putting their money in internet companies that had no real product to warehouse and no business plan. Looked like easy money at the time, so they just basically pulled up stakes and tried to get us to go into Chapter 7, which is bankruptcy from which you do not emerge. We ended up selling to Mattel, but Mattel at that time bought up every girl game company, literally, in the space and killed all but one of them. So that whole movement just died because Mattel was defending its Barbie franchise. At this point, I wouldn't do it again because I don't need to. Now there's enough going on the web, and even in massively multiplayer games, that the problems we were trying to solve aren't present. So this is an artifact of cultural history, but it brought me a lot of insights, and I wanted to share it. And it's just totally central to this whole exercise was human-centered design research. Yes?
So I wanted to push back on that point a little bit, actually. It feels like in terms of getting girls' hands on a computer, certainly there's been tons of progress. We've seen women are actually more active on social media, apps, phones, all these things have really, I think, led to a lot of that. But in terms of perhaps some of the goals of giving rehearsal space and these kinds of things, I'm less convinced that we've made progress. I was wondering.
Oh, no, I totally agree.
Okay.
I don't want to bitch about it, but yeah, I mean, that's not there to a large extent. And I think in the same way, the kinds of things we're doing with augmented reality are really trivialized and paying very much less attention than they should to the natural world. So there are a lot of holes in what we're doing now. I agree. I wish somebody would do it. All right, so quickly, here we are at our first E3. That's my daughter who just had a baby, just gave me a grandson, playing around with a giant locker at E3. E3 was great. I had my daughters be the booth babes. So they would come up to the salesman and say, "Mister, you got to come see that, and you can't turn that one down." So we had huge amounts of traffic at the booth. These are some of the products we made. You can see the secret stones and stuff. Anyway, long story short, nobody got rich. The thing got sold to Mattel and killed. But during the time that it lived, it had a great audience. I think it made a cultural difference in the world. And I'm still proud of it, and I learned a lot. So there you go. I wrote this book. The first book I would have written would have been really bitter. And I had to get over, I got to sort of vomit that stuff out after you get clobbered like this. So I was able to then go back and look at why I'd done it and what I learned from it. And there's a lot about business in this book, as well as the history of that endeavor. So now I get about twice a week, I'll get email from somebody who says, "I just wanted to thank you. I played those games, and I was thinking about them today." And I send them a copy of this. The note says, "Here's how the sausage was made." And it's fun because often they'll get back to me and say, "Yeah, I'm a design student, dude. I know what you're talking about." So it's fun. This I'm going to skip over because I don't think we need to talk about this, and I've talked too long. Go next, please. So this is kind of where I am now. Do you recognize this map? Do you know where this is? This is Mendocino, Cape Mendocino. And the map is from Gulliver's Travels. So it's a little distorted, but you can kind of make out the landscape. New Albion here is the part north of Mendocino, I guess, and it had sort of mystical significance in the day. So this is kind of where I am now, I guess. Sailing with my little boat, and here be monsters. But we're starting at the technology side now. I've really become tremendously interested in distributed sensing, primarily by having exposure to the work of Sean White at Columbia, who's now at Nokia Labs, which is quickly circling the drain, so I don't know where he'll be next, but he's amazing, and he's an alum of your program. So now we can have like large pictures of large expanses of the natural world with heterogeneous sensing to model a place in a much more accurate, dynamic way. So we're still about place here. But to me, that's just incredibly important. Now, distributed computing as a model, I bring it up because I think there are some failure modes involved with it. You know about distributed computing, like you sign up your CPU hours while you're asleep to go work on SETI, or that somebody uses your CPU to work on protein folding or some large problem that even supercomputers can't solve. The difficulty with it is, have you tried to do this? The UI sucks beyond belief. And you never get a representation of what's being discovered. You know, the larger view. Everybody's participating, but you don't see any results. You're just sort of lending your CPU. So that's not very satisfying, I guess. So when you put those two observations together with the ubiquity of mobile devices, and participatory sensing becomes a much more interesting way to think about looking at the world in a dynamic way that involves all of us, sort of crowdsourcing a picture of our world. This is a little side effect, talk about augmented reality for a minute. This is another technology that I think has enormous promise. And yet, what do people use it for? You know, you see these great apps where you aim the thing down the street and it tells you where there's a good restaurant, or where's the nearest McDonald's. And then you've got a very few things like StarWalk and LeafSnap. They're helping you look at the world around you and see it in a different way. To me, that's a really important, necessary thing that I myself, and I think most of us as designers, ought to be doing, is to pierce the spectacle to a certain extent and get around back of the scenery and have a look at this down here and look at it in ways that make us fall in love with it again. Because my hypothesis is that delight is stronger than fear as a motivation for changing your perspective on things. That's a side channel. So I am very interested in participatory sensing and ways of seeing Earth, ways of seeing Gaia as a system and all of its little component parts. If I had an AR app to let me look at rhizomes, I'd be completely thrilled, just thrilled beyond belief. If I were able to participate in a project that helped us look at climate, temperature change, species movement from local places and join together to build a larger picture of that, somebody's doing stuff. There are people doing stuff in that vein. I think a larger project is called for. So I'm a subscriber to the Gaia hypothesis. Interesting that about 80% of the scientific biological sciences community does subscribe to this notion. It's still, many of us feel like it's edgy, like it's woo-woo, the Gaia hypothesis, the work of Lovelock. It's not considered woo-woo by the science community. What this says is that the Earth and its atmosphere and its biosphere could be looked at as an organism with constituent parts, including the minerals and stuff, and that this thing works as a system in a certain way to keep us within a range of homeostasis in climate. And it depends on a lot of stuff like biodiversity, global warming, the warmth of the atmosphere, etc. You tip that thing too far, you lose the homeostatic shield that we have, and things just go haywire. I'm oversimplifying, but it's really worth reading. Lovelock has a last book called The Changing Face of Gaia, I guess. It's really thinking about the larger system of Earth as being the thing that's affected by climate change. So reading Margulis and Lovelock has changed my life. This notion of nature, both nature and technology, okay, I'm winding down here. This is my wisdom that I can offer today. We have a problem in the technology community and in culture in general of thinking of technology as the other, as this thing I use. as this thing I make, as this thing I'm sometimes afraid of. That's not true. Technology is an extrusion of the human spirit. And it's just as much a part of us as anything else we've ever made and use every day, like clothing. To other it, is to invite a way of thinking about our relationship with technology that doesn't lead us in a positive direction, as far as I'm concerned. Likewise, we other nature. We talk about the natural world as if it was over there. The natural world is in this room. It's in your body, it's in your clothes, it's in the sky, it's coming through the air vents. We're soaking in it. We're constantly immersed in the natural world, no matter what structures or architectures we find ourselves in. To other it, to talk about it as if it were something other than us, leads us in the wrong direction in terms of what we do with the capabilities that we have. That's a preachment, and that's where I'm trying to put myself at this point in my life, is to think about what is the good, to take the things I've learned, like the Laurel maneuver, somebody's got a grand strategic goal to make money, can I also, hook something on it that gets us started looking and falling in love with the world that we could take better care of. So I'm down with that. I've learned recently that you kind of need the spectacle, but that's another talk. One of the biggest conundrums of this notion of participatory computing or even distributed computing is, okay, what does it look like? If I want to make a display of what people all over, say, Canada are sensing, what does that look like? Barry Lopez once said to me that when a painting doesn't have vanishing point perspective, we call it primitive art. And he said, we ought to call it community art. And it gave me a clue that there's a real challenge in terms of information representation to look for alternatives to the perspective POV that we're used to when we're looking at information that's crowdsourced. And I would just love to work on that problem too, so see me after class. And Rob's term for all of this, all these shenanigans, is Gaian gardening, which I sort of like. It's a kind of mindfulness that I think we lack sometimes, and that new affordances that we have right now can really turn that around. And I'm really excited about it. So there's where I'm sailing on the sea. And thank you for listening to me tell my stories. Questions? Oh, there's another little piece. Here's a front of Coda here. This is Albion, California. I don't know if you can hear it. Oh, you're not hearing the audio. We're kayaking through a sea cave. We often play Tibetan bowls in strange environments. It's an environmental recording my husband made. Three-dimensional audio. So there's Albion. Just had to have that little NorCal woo-woo moment for you. Okay, any questions? Comments? Yes?
You talked about how a top-down design for the world is probably not going to work. And now here on the last slide you talked about Gaian gardening, which seems like a very, very top-down approach to fixing the world.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. I can see how you would read that. But I guess... So there's this business in the Bible about domination, right? That man is here to dominate the plants and the animals and, run the ship. That's top down, right? Gardening is something that a lot of people do in a lot of different places, and sometimes they have farmers markets. And, so as a metaphor, thinking about gardening as being mindful and cultivating things that grow in the earth that we need, that's why I'm using that metaphor. I don't mean let's, quickly put fertilizer on everything, and right, okay. Although we could. Other questions, comments? Yo.
So about the othering, I feel like our response to it for many years has actually been to just diffuse technology out into the natural world, particularly because computing vision.
Yeah, the infrastructure is model.
Right. Are you advocating something that doesn't require that, something that is perhaps more of a perspective shift than a technology shift?
Yes, it's a perspective shift, and I would put it alongside your infrastructure model. The difference is that infrastructure Well, it's not different. Infrastructure often just grows. So you could put it the same way. The difference is that when you think about the infrastructure of this building, you really can't say that this is all, everything about the building is infrastructure. But when you think about not othering the infrastructure and think of it more like the circulatory system and start looking at things with that perspective in mind, you get to a more generic, not generic, all-encompassing metaphor, I guess. And I sort of prefer the notion of not othering in the contexts that I'm using it. I think that the two metaphors can easily live side by side. I get upset when people say, oh, well, let me give you an example drawn from reality, from Sean White's work. They had a distributed sensing environment in a hectare of land, and different kinds of sensors giving different kinds of information. And they invited some botanists in, and some of the botanists got hardened tablets, and some of them got augmented reality see-through displays. And when he asked the guys with the tablets what was going on, they said, the sensor is getting information, it's transmitting it to my computer is constructing a display for me. And when they asked the guys with the head-mounted displays what was going on, they said, the plant is sending me information. So the cognitive distance got collapsed. Now that's dangerous if what you're doing is the McDonald's thing, you know? I mean, that's a two-edged sword. But that's kind of what I mean about like breaking it down and seeing it as not this other thing over here, sending stuff to here. I'm on the same rant that I always have been, right? But to see the world differently. Yep.
So I thought it was really exciting when you're talking about some of the storytelling behind the AR stuff and how you might use that to introduce something new into the environment and see how people behave with that new thing. When you're constructing those stories, though, and you said that one important piece was this audio, and that the visuals were maybe not as important depending on the context. What is it that you look for in that creating that story? Is it more about the story, or is it more about the environment? Like,
you're talking about VR, not AR, right? Right. I think it's both. I think one thing is the story that a person can construct by interacting with the environment. So therefore, that has to do with the designed affordances of the environment and the way they predispose people to have dramatically interesting experiences. So that's the story from the inside out. The story from the outside is that we've pigeonholed this medium into a certain set of purposes that it doesn't have to be exclusively what we use it for. We can blow it out. And you can say the same thing about augmented reality, early AR applications on our cell phones, that they really tend to be commercial, social, superficial things. And we can do much more with them, and there are examples of that, and I'd like to see more of that happen. Does that help? Okay. Yes? You talk a lot. I love it.
Sorry. You talked about the storytelling that people did, and a lattice that was created essentially. And whenever I think of the sort of emergent behavior, I keep wondering how you would predict that. Why would you think that people would do that?
I didn't.
Okay.
It totally surprised me. It was emergent behavior. I thought people would leave little stories in those rocks because the affordances for, well, we briefed people before they came in so they knew that they were voice holders, but they also were pretty obvious what they did. The fact that people worked together and arranged lattices was an emergent phenomenon.
Going back, do you think there would be a way to predict that sort of
that people would do that?
Yeah, I mean, if I had to build a system today and I want to, see what emergent behavior might happen, is there a systematic way I could go about it, or is it still dark territory?
Well, so just it's a hard question. I think a fundamental principle of emergent behavior is that there's a relatively small n of rules. And if in a group emergent behavior situation, like say an anthill or a beehive, There's a small n of rules. If you change one of those rules a little bit, completely different things can happen to the group behavior. So as long as you have the small n of rules to play around with, you can tweak them in simulation, and you may discover using ideas drawn from swarm intelligence and stuff like that, you may discover the likelihood of certain things to happen. But I don't think it's ever going to be like utterly predictable. If it were, I'd die of boredom, right? I mean, this is how we learn stuff, when people make things we didn't expect, right? The telephone was invented to transmit symphony concerts from one city to another. Comments? Yes.
As someone who works with visualization a lot, I was particularly intrigued by brief comments about information representation. And so I was just hoping you might elaborate. I had a sense that you were pushing back against some kind of forms of representation or ways of looking at this collected data. So I wanted to hear more about that.
I'm just wondering, it's not a problem I can immediately get a grip on, and I can't, I'm working on it, but, reading and looking at stuff. But why do you, it's like a pull-down menu in VR. Why go to the trouble to involve people widely distributed over space to create a database of, sensor data or whatever that contributes to a larger model, and then reduce that again to a single point perspective? It doesn't make sense. Am I making any sense at all?
Give me an example of the single point perspective you have in mind.
So let's say I'm getting sensor data about, like Joey Ito's thing about radiation after Fukushima, and we can see hotspots on a map and stuff. Now, the way you're going to look at that is like I'm looking at it from here. But what if I'm looking at it from here, even though I'm there? I mean, you want to be able to not just move your POV around, but it's a mapping problem. And maybe it's not possible. But what I would like is for people to be able to get, sort of an equivalence of value looking at the distribution of data without having to go back into my little head and my little eyes. How do we give people the sense that they're looking at something that each part of which is alive or comes from something alive? Did you see Lauren Carpenter's red-green thing at SIGGRAPH? You saw that? That's the kind of thing I mean, He gave everybody in the audience a stick, like a paint stirring stick, and there was a tab on it, and one side was bright red, shiny, and the other was bright green, shiny. And he had built a computer program that could look at the colors and do things. What happened was you could see a representation on the screen of the whole audience, and you couldn't tell where you were because it was, 5,000 people in a hall. You really couldn't see where you were. And the first thing he said, I think, was to just like, okay, everybody on the left go green, so people are doing it. And then we got around to, okay, let's see if we can spell a word. It was a short word or something. Like that. It was astonishing how quickly people were able to create imagery, not knowing where they were, by looking at that view. And at the end of the thing, they had us flying Microsoft Flight Simulator with these sticks. We crashed it, didn't we? Yeah. But it was up for a while. It's like extraordinary. I guess that's that eerie sort of distributed feeling that I would love to see in an information representation of a crowdsourced or participatory thing. And I don't know how to do that, but I'm like obsessed with it. Want to help? Okay, well, thank you. I think we've overstayed our welcome here. So good. Thanks very much.